On the last day of 2006, somewhere inside the British Treasury, a clerk processed a wire transfer of $83 million to the United States government. There was no ceremony, no speech, no gathered dignitaries pressing their hands together in the cold December air. The man, we don't know his name, nobody thought to record it, likely finished the transaction, closed the screen, and went to lunch. The debt that had hung over Britain for 61 years, the debt that had quietly dismantled the largest empire in human history, was settled with the same administrative energy one might bring to paying a gas bill. $83 million. A Tuesday. A wire transfer. 300 years of empire. You'd think someone might have noted the occasion. But that is the thing about the end of Britain's empire. It didn't end the way empires are supposed to end. There was no single decisive battle, no storming of a capital. No moment where a defeated general handed over his sword on the deck of a warship. It ended through a process far less cinematic and far more brutal. A payment schedule, negotiated in a Washington conference room, signed under duress, by a dying man who knew the terms were wrong and signed them anyway because the alternative was darkness. To understand how it happened, you have to begin at the last moment Britain still believed in itself. And that moment, with almost poetic precision, was November 1956, the Suez Canal. The last imperial gesture of a country that had not yet fully admitted what it had become. Anthony Eden had been waiting to be prime minister for so long that the waiting had become its own kind of damage. 15 years as Churchill's heir apparent, 15 years of deference and patience and the grinding subordination of a man who believes, correctly, as it happened, that he is more than capable, but must wait for the large shadow ahead of him to move. By the time Eden finally reached Downing Street in 1955, he was 57 years old, chronically unwell, dependent on amphetamines that his doctors prescribed with an optimism that history would not vindicate, and in possession of a clarity about Britain's place in the world that was in the most generous interpretation. When Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July 1956, nationalized it, as in took the thing that had been built through Egyptian labor on Egyptian soil and announced that it would henceforth belong to Egypt rather than to a Franco-British company in Paris, Eden experienced it as a personal insult delivered to civilization itself. He told his cabinet that Nasser must not be allowed to have his hand on Britain's windpipe. He told his diary that this was Munich all over again, that Nasser was a new Hitler, that appeasement would only feed the beast. The analogies came easily to a man of his generation and background. What came less easily, apparently, was an accurate assessment of what decade it was. Britain coordinated in secret with France and Israel. The plan was elegant in the conspiratorial sense and catastrophic in every other. Israel would invade Egypt, Britain and France would intervene as peacemakers, seize the canal in the process, and present the world with a fait accompli. The great power would have acted. The windpipe would be secured. Nasser would be humiliated. Eden would have had his Churchill moment. He had not, in all of this planning, adequately accounted for the telephone call from Washington. Dwight Eisenhower was a man of considerable patience and very clear priorities, and his priorities did not include covering for British imperial nostalgia in the middle of the Cold War. When he discovered that his closest ally had launched a military operation in the Middle East without so much as a courtesy warning, his displeasure was expressed with the quiet precision of someone who does not need to raise his voice because the entire weight of the American economy is making the argument for him. The message delivered to London was stripped of diplomatic softening to the point of surgical clarity. Withdraw, or the United States would pull its support from sterling on the international currency markets. This was not a rhetorical threat. The United States held enough sterling reserves and enough influence over the International Monetary Fund to trigger a run on the pound that Britain, with its depleted reserves and its debt-ravaged finances, had absolutely no capacity to withstand. The pound would collapse. The economy would follow. Eden could have his canal, or he could have a functioning currency. He could not have both. Within days, the invasion was over. The troops came home. Eden resigned in January 1957. His health destroyed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the gap between self-image and reality. He died in 1977, having spent 20 years watching the rest of the empire follow the canal into history. The reason a phone call from Washington could do this, the reason Britain had no reserves, no leverage, no ground to stand on, was not an accident. It was a debt. And the debt had a history. Rewind 11 years to a Washington conference room in the autumn of 1945, and you find John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of his century, and quite possibly any other, sitting across a table from American negotiators with a briefcase, a failing heart, and an argument built on the concept of justice. He was tall, gaunt, the color of old paper, already carrying the cardiac damage that would kill him the following April. His doctors had told him the journey was inadvisable. He had gone anyway because nobody else could do it. And because he still believed, with the faith of a man who has built his life on the power of correct reasoning, that a sufficiently well-made argument would eventually be heard. Britain needed money. This was not a diplomatic formulation. It was a physiological fact about a nation that had spent 6 years consuming itself to survive. The national debt had reached 220% of GDP. Gold reserves were gone. Not depleted, gone. Overseas investments that had been accumulated across generations of empire, the financial architecture of 3 centuries of global dominance, had been sold off piece by piece since 1939. The country had rationing, bomb damage, a demolished merchant fleet, and a newly elected labor government that had made promises about hospitals and housing to a population that had earned those promises in ways that did not bear casual contemplation. Keynes went to Washington expecting a grant. He had prepared the case for it with meticulous care. Britain had stood alone in 1940 while America sat in comfortable neutrality and debated. Britain had absorbed 2 years of war, the bombs over London, the Atlantic convoys, the North African desert, the cost paid in bodies and buildings, and the slow bleeding of everything the country owned, before Pearl Harbor made the conflict America's problem too. The moral arithmetic, as Keynes presented it, was straightforward. Justice demanded generosity. He laid this out in the elegant and forceful prose that had made him famous, to men who were listening with the attentiveness of people who have already decided the answer. What he received was a loan, $3.75 billion at 2% interest over 50 years. The historian Alan Sked would later write that the Americans didn't seem to realize Britain was bankrupt, which is a generous reading of a negotiation in which the American team had, as a precondition for entering talks at all, required Britain to open its books entirely, every reserve, every account, every last figure, and had then demanded the sale of a major British-owned American company as proof that the patient was genuinely ruined and not merely performing poverty for sympathy. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it with the calm, focused clarity of a country that had spent the war turning itself into the world's dominant industrial and financial power and was now formalizing that dominance on paper. The historian Michael Hudson put it plainly. Roosevelt understood that Lend-Lease would accomplish not just the defeat of Germany, but the permanent repositioning of British and American economic power. Britain would win the war. America would inherit what victory left behind. And the loan came with conditions that made the interest rate almost beside the point. Britain must abandon imperial preference, the trading system that had given empire member nations commercial advantage with each other and served as the economic connective tissue of the entire imperial structure. Sterling must be made convertible to dollars. British markets must open. The architecture of empire must be dismantled as a condition of survival. In the House of Lords, the terms were called unconscionable. One peer argued that Britain was being asked to mortgage its economic sovereignty to finance its own extinction. The debate was fierce, and the conclusion was foregone. Parliament ratified the agreement. The country, as everyone in the room understood, had no other option. There is a particular quality of humiliation in accepting terms you have already correctly identified as humiliating, and then watching the door close behind you. Keynes flew home. He was dead within 6 months. The pound was made convertible in the summer of 1947, as agreed. Within 5 weeks, the dollar drain was so catastrophic that convertibility had to be suspended. The condition had been met, the damage done, and the empire's economic glue had dissolved in the heat of it. But even 1945 was not the beginning. The stripping had started years before Keynes ever boarded that plane. In the brutal arithmetic of a war, Britain had entered with courage and insufficient dollars. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and Britain declared war, the American position was neutrality. A perfectly reasonable position for a country separated from the conflict by an ocean and a strong institutional preference for not spending its young men on other people's problems. The arrangement for Britain's weapons purchases was called cash and carry, a name with the cheerful directness of a corner shop. You want American guns? Come and collect. Bring payment. Britain came. Britain paid. In dollars, then in gold, then in the liquidated remains of its own foreign investments. British-owned companies in America sold quietly and urgently, like a family stripping a house ahead of the bailiffs, turning 3 centuries of accumulated overseas wealth into the ammunition required to survive the present week. By the time Congress debated the Lend-Lease Act in early 1941, the program that would allow Britain to receive American supplies without immediate payment, the equivalent of £120 billion in gold and bonds, had crossed the Atlantic in convoy. The largest movement of physical wealth in history, shipped through seas where German submarines hunted because the alternative was worse. The gold sat in Canadian vaults. The empire's 3-century financial accumulation sat with it, reclassified now from asset to memory. The price of Lend-Lease, before a single crate of supplies moved, was full disclosure. The Americans required Britain to open its books, completely, intimately, the full picture of a great power's insolvency laid out across treasury desks like a medical file. Then the sale. A significant British-owned American company converted to dollars. The proof required that nothing was being held back, that the patient was not mailing grain. Only then did the supplies flow. Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, reviewed those documents with the focused care of a man who understood that he was not merely assessing creditworthiness. He was witnessing a transfer of power that would take another decade to complete, but was already, in every financial sense that mattered, accomplished. America did not enter the Second World War until December 1941, when Japan settled the question at Pearl Harbor. By that point, Britain had been at war for 27 months on the financial equivalent of fumes. The empire that had once been the world's largest creditor, that had financed railways across India and dams across Egypt and wars across every continent, had been reduced to demonstrating its own destitution to secure the credit it needed to survive. It was the most extraordinary audition in history, a great power, proving to its former colony that it was poor enough to deserve help. Go back further still, to the summer of 1914, and the British Empire stands at the apex of 3 centuries of expansion, trade, and the unshakable Victorian conviction that British management of the world was simply what the world required. 412 million subjects, a navy that ruled every ocean, a financial system so dominant that the pound sterling was not merely a currency, but a global operating assumption, the medium through which international commerce conducted itself, the standard against which everything else was measured. London was where nations borrowed. Britain did not borrow. It was the entity others borrowed from. This had been true for so long that it had ceased to feel like an arrangement and had begun to feel like a law of nature. 4 years of the Western Front dissolved that assumption. In mud and cordite, in the specific financial catastrophe of fighting a modern industrial war without the resources to sustain it. The national debt went from £650 million in 1914 to $7.7 billion by 1919. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917 and formalized what had been happening in the credit markets for years, the shift was structural and permanent. The world's creditor was changing. The dollar was beginning the long, patient work of relieving sterling of its responsibilities. Britain owed America $4.368 billion when the armistice came in November 1918. Payments were made through the 20s, dutifully if resentfully, the financial equivalent of a man paying alimony to a marriage he preferred not to think about. Then the Great Depression arrived, Europe's economies buckled, and at the Lausanne Conference of 1932, Britain simply stopped. The Americans objected, no formal agreement was reached. The debt was never canceled, never confronted, never honestly resolved. It simply sat in the ledgers, a large and growing problem that both governments had tacitly agreed to pretend did not exist, while Britain continued performing the role of empire, acquiring new territories at Versailles, drawing new lines on maps of the Middle East, sending administrators and soldiers and gunboats to corners of the world that had not requested them, as though the unpaid bills in the drawer were entirely unrelated to the quality of the performance. They were not unrelated, they were the whole story. 7 years later, the guns started again, and the bills came due with compound interest and conditions attached. On the last day of 2006, the account closed. $83 million to Washington. $23.6 million to Canada, for a separate thread of the same debt and a separate chapter of the same story. The clerk processed both. Outside the Treasury windows, London moved black cabs, red buses, the city's ordinary mundane momentum, with the practical wisdom of a place that has learned not to spend too much time looking backwards. The empire was long gone by then. India had gone in 1947, the year the pound convertibility crisis made the loans conditions concrete and irreversible. Malaya, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Cyprus, Aden, the departures came in waves through the 50s and 60s, each one described in official statements as orderly, planned, an expression of Britain's enlightened commitment to the principle of self-determination. And each one occurred within a financial reality that made the alternative: continued occupation, continued garrisons, continued administration across 6 time zones, a budget line that no chancellor could defend while also keeping the hospitals open. The Suez humiliation had only confirmed in public what the balance sheets had been saying in private for a decade, that Britain could no longer act as an independent imperial power without American consent, that the phone call from Washington could come at any moment. That sterling was not the pound of 1914. Backed by the full confidence of the world's largest creditor nation, it was a managed currency belonging to a country that owed, and had owed since the Somme, and had been paying, sometimes in money, sometimes in sovereignty, sometimes in empire itself, ever since. 300 years, assembled through enterprise and violence, and the particular genius of a small island that decided the world was available for management. Ended not by revolution, not by conquest, not by any of the dramatic ruptures that history tends to favor. Ended by a payment schedule, by conditions attached to a loan, by the patient arithmetic of a former colony that understood, far earlier and far more clearly than London did, that empires are not built on flags or on the color of maps. They are built on who holds the debt. The Americans had held it since 1917. They had waited with the unhurried confidence of people who know the compound interest is running in their favor for the ledger to catch up with reality. On December 31st, 2006, it did. I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. Subscribe now. If you think this documentary is wrong, explain where. If you think it's right, explain. Here's another moment History Met Economics.